Hi, this is Rayne at Rediscovered Books, and today I wanted to share with you some of our staff's recommended picks for Black Lives Matter and anti-racist reading. So many of us are having conversations about these issues, that more so now than ever, and so we wanted to give you a few suggestions of titles that you could pick up to expand your knowledge and find ways that you can engage with these issues in your own community. So our first pick here is Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad. If you've read White Fragility, then this is a great next step. It's equal parts a really thoughtful analysis of white supremacy, white privilege, what allyship looks like, and all of these other issues that are vitally important. And it's also a excellent reflective journal. Several of my coworkers have read this book or listened to the audiobook, and they highly, highly recommend it because each chapter ends with a series of prompts that really get you thinking about the ways that these elements play into our lives that many of us are blind to, that we can't see because of that privilege. And they've all described it as challenging but extremely rewarding. And our next recommendation is actually two books. The original Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, or the young adult adaptation, which was written by Jason Reynolds. And both of these are a really great deep dive into the history of racist and anti-racist ideas from the very beginnings of slavery and the justifications for that, all the way up to the present day. Both of these are excellent reads. If you are shopping for a younger reader, or if you yourself are less of a nonfiction buff and want something that goes over all of these important issues in detail, but in a somewhat more accessible, kind of conversational way, and that manages to make these really heavy topics a little bit less heavy and emotionally exhausting to learn about, then Stamped is a great choice. So what I personally did was I listened to the audiobook of this, which is narrated by Jason Reynolds, and he is an absolutely amazing narrator. And then I went in and dove into Stamped from the Beginning, the original edition, which is very, very well researched and thorough, but it's also probably the most readable history book of its scale that I've ever read. Ibram Kendi is a really skilled historian, and he goes into depth about these 400 plus years of history of racist ideas and breaks them down in a way that's really easy to understand. We also have one of our perennial bestsellers that we actually ran out of stock in the store right now, but we are going to get some back in soon, is How to Be an Anti-Racist, also by Ibram Kendi. That is focused much more on the present, and it's much more of a how-to manual about tackling anti-racism in your own life, in your own community. And speaking of Black history, James Baldwin, as we all know, was one of the iconic figures of the civil rights era, and his writings are still incredibly relevant, incredibly insightful today. And we have plenty of his original texts in stock if you're looking for those. But whether you have or have not read any of his stuff before, another great place to dive in is this newer release, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own by Eddie S. Glaude. He is a really, really great writer and speaker. I actually had the pleasure of listening to a virtual author event between him and Cornel West, who is probably one of the most prominent and defining Black intellectuals of our time. Glaude was going into detail about his process of researching this book, actually reaching out to and contacting James Baldwin's descendants and going to visit his grave site and getting a perspective on his life as a writer, as an activist, as a pioneering icon of the Black civil rights movement, especially as a gay man, that many of us would not have had the pleasure of getting to experience or learn. And Glaude does an excellent job of presenting that in this book. It's partly a biography of Baldwin, it's partly a history of his writing and an analysis of what his philosophies were. And it's partly, like the subtitle suggests, a lesson on how to apply those ideas to our own time and our own activism. And we also have some memoirs that I like to share with you. Personally, I'm a huge memoir reader. I appreciate history, but I also like to get a more intimate, personal look at these issues through a specific writer's eyes. And one of my favorite recommendations for that aspect of the Black Lives Matter conversation is from friend of the store, Mitchell Jackson. We had the pleasure of hosting him this spring, and he was also one of the Cabin's featured guests from last fall when he was in conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates. He is an excellent orator, and he's an excellent writer. So this is his memoir of his childhood and time growing up in Portland, Oregon as a Black working class man in one of the whitest cities in the country. And the first chapter of this book is such a great hook to bring you into this story. He actually imagines the life of one of his ancestors who was an escaped slave who fled to Oregon, and how he would have navigated living in this space that was literally legislatively founded with the intentions of being an all-white city. From then on, the rest of the book is all about these ideas of identity and how you fit into a place that doesn't want you, but it's also about relationships, and it's about his story of overcoming poverty and drug abuse and imprisonment, and also of his education and his relationships with these really influential father figures and his relationships with other people that he's encountered throughout his life. And one of the absolute most amazing and innovative parts of this book is the survivor files that are inserted throughout, which are these second-person vignettes that Jackson writes based on the most informative life events of 16 of his Black male relatives. So even though this is definitely focused on Jackson's own perspective in life, it's a really, really dynamic and innovative, multi-perspective look on history, on the present day, and on all kinds of different facets of the Black experience that so many of our media portrayals don't convey. All of these topics can be challenging to talk about, to think about, to read about. They are very emotionally heavy. So sometimes you want something that still addresses these important issues, but does so in a little bit of a lighter, funny way. And for that, I highly recommend Here For It, or How to Save Your Soul in America by R. Eric Thomas. This is a memoir in essays by a columnist for Elle.com and well-known comedy writer. And he goes into detail about his own life experience growing up at the intersection of being a Black, gay, but observant Christian man, and the challenges that that sometimes presents. But he also just shares a lot of really hilarious stories from his life as a writer and as a person. Like, my favorite essay from this whole collection talks about his roommate's haunted Krampus doll and the night terrors that he would have imagining this doll watching him from the shelf and plotting and scheming to steal his soul away. And it's just so funny, but also so thought-provoking, the way that he talks about the intersections of his own life and his own experience, and the kind of hope that he gives the reader for a bit of a better future. So this one's just a great little pick-me-up while still talking about these important issues. This is one of my favorite memoirs that I've read in the last couple of years, How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. The author's an award-winning poet, and this is his story of growing up Black and gay in the South, and of his complex and evolving relationship with his mother throughout her life. And it's painful and devastating and absolutely beautifully written. Like, this is a book that you're going to want to just highlight passages of and come back to and revisit. And our next quick rec is Unapologetic, a Black, Queer, and Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements by Charlene A. Carruthers. And this is also in the vein of Me and White Supremacy and How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a handbook, manual, and manifesto for a more inclusive and intersectional anti-racist movement. So one of our favorite fiction picks is The Residue Years by Mitchell S. Jackson, which is an autobiographical novel based on his life growing up Black in Portland in the 90s, again with his signature, stunning, just evocative, almost musical voice. And last but not least, we have Deacon King Kong by James McBride, one of my personal picks for Book of the Year. It was Oprah's book club pick most recently, and it's a cabin selection for this coming fall. It's a historical fiction novel set in 1960s Brooklyn in the projects, and it's a patchwork of interweaving stories of different characters, and ultimately a story about the life of a place that all centers on one of the most unforgettable and hilarious characters ever written, Deacon King Kong himself, Sport Coat. Well, thank you for watching. We have plenty more where that came from. Either come down to the shop, give us a call, reach out to us on social media, or visit us on our website at rdbooks.org, and we'd be happy to find a book that's just perfect for you.